Calling you for freedom, freedom. You know you can hear that call. Oh, we're calling for freedom.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening and welcome to the special focus. I am Zahid Jadwat and we are together until 8 p.m. tonight right here on Salam Media. We are coming to you live via our live stream on salammedia.com/listen-live on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel as well as live on our Twitter page. Thank you so much for tuning in. Now, last week, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that South Africa will move to alert level 1 of the government's risk adjusted strategy, which is in place in order to combat the COVID 19 pandemic. This took effect on Monday this week to the relief of many businesses who are reeling from the effects of tight restrictions which were in place over the last few months. Although a few restrictions remain in place under alert level 1, most businesses have returned to a so called new normal, and it's time to count the costs of the coronavirus pandemic. And it's also time to draw up new plans to revive the economy that has been brought to its knees. Tonight, we find out how COVID 19 has impacted South Africans and our already weak economy. We also find out what it would take to revive the economy and what business would look like under the new normal. Remember that you can participate in this conversation. You know how to do that. You can send us a WhatsApp text message on the number 0617660355. You can also tweet and tag at Salam Media, or you could leave a comment below our Facebook and YouTube live streams. Anything on your mind, really, even just a thumbs up to let us know that you are tuned in and hopefully enjoying the show. With that said, let me introduce you to our panelists for tonight. Firstly, we have Professor Gilad Isaacs, who is the co-director of the Institute for Economic Justice, and he's also a lecturer in economics at the School of Economic and Finance at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Thank you so much for joining us.
Evening. Thanks very much for inviting me.
We also have Mr. Jonathan Katzenellenbogen, who is a weekly finance columnist at the Daily Friend, and he is also the former economics editor at Business Day. Thank you so much for joining us, to you as well.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
Let me also introduce Mr. Nzabe Derek Shlungwane, who is an SME growth consultant at the Institute of Business Advisors, Southern Africa. Thank you for joining us this evening as well. Mr. Shlungwane? Okay, it seems we are having trouble connecting with Mr. Shlungwane at the moment, but I'm sure the technical team is working on it and they will try to get him on as soon as possible. But in the meantime, let me also introduce Mr. Mialane Mkabela, who is an economist and the director at Answisa Transaction Advisory. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, and your viewers.
All right, so Professor Isaacs, let's get straight to it. When President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that the country would go into a total lockdown back in March, it was obvious that the inevitable result would be disastrous for the economy. So to begin with, how would you best describe the economic impact of COVID-19 in South Africa? I mean, the best estimate during the initial stages of the lockdown was that the lockdown would cost about 13 billion rands per day.
Excellent, thanks. It was inevitable it would have an impact, but the severity of the impact is significantly shaped by the emergency measures or the lack thereof, which government implemented. Overall, we're expecting to see about a 10% fall in GDP, although estimates vary. That's about 500 billion rand less in economic output in the economy. But, you know, on top of these kind of very broad aggregate numbers, it's important to understand how this impacts individuals and, of course, how this impacts different groups in unequal ways. So between February and April, which is the first wave of the survey data which we have, we saw about 3 million people lose employment. Importantly, 2/3 of those were female. What we saw is a significant rise in hunger. Hunger levels almost doubled. including in child hunger, where about half of all adults said their household somebody went hungry. What we saw is a increased burden of home-based care, which again women suffered more from, and of course it is lower income and poor people who have suffered most at the increase in unemployment, in income loss, and in poverty. So all of this is very alarming, and it's continued despite the measures put in place. So the well-known charity Gift of the Givers has concluded last week that the scope of hunger is like in war times.
Mhm. And of course, the loss of 3 million jobs, just as you spoke about just now, in just a few months, is not at all beneficial in a country where the economy is in serious trouble, even before COVID-19. And I see we've just been joined by Mr. Shlungwani. He's finally here with us, Mr. Nzawe Derek Shlungwani. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry that I think I had some glitches, but I'm catching up because I've been listening from the beginning of the show.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Now, we do understand that you work with small businesses as a consultant at the Institute of Business Advisors, Southern Africa. So could you just paint us a picture of how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected small businesses in South Africa?
Well, overall, it's very dire for small businesses. And unfortunately, there is no way out for now that one can look at except at the promised relief funds and all that, which I believe that when you walk on the street, you might not even show one business that can say, yes, I got that funding, unless they are keeping it secret. However, the pressure is there, and now we are experiencing a lot of businesses that are closing down. And unfortunately, if you're a small business, you cannot just sell out. The only option out would be just to sit down and sell whatever you have. But you cannot say you're selling your business. So I would say that based on that, we are looking at how do we now bring them back to action. But it's difficult if you want to do that without any cash that is available or without any capital that you can say you can resuscitate a business, or you can, but by just advising alone, you cannot resuscitate a business. You need some funding, some resources that you can put into the business for it to be back into its feet. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so of course, as you mentioned, there were relief funds which were set aside for the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic. So where do you think these measures have fallen short? Just quickly before we move on, Mr. Sangwani.
Well, the measures, I wouldn't say that they fell anywhere, but what we have observed from our side is that if you look at the banks, that they've committed 200 billion, and only so far almost 13 billion or less has been distributed. But if you look at the distribution of the funds, you find that it's more on the side of only the businesses that were already in their books, but also it could be that the funds that have been either issued in the form of loans to those businesses. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself and say, how many small businesses were qualifying for these loans? You'll find that the majority of them were not qualifying, although the extension was made to say up to December 2019. But still, there are a lot of small businesses that did not qualify, even in that category. So we are now faced with a situation where we have to question and say, if there was the money that was issued, and only maybe 10% or whatever percentage that we are looking at, where is the rest of the rescue, and when is it gonna, how long it's gonna take to reach out to small businesses? And unfortunately, if you are in a situation where you are wrestling with the big corporates that are looking for bailouts and are looking for acquisition and money, small businesses get pushed right at the bottom, and which is not good for them actually to be able to stand again, you know.
Mm. And of course, it's not, well, these relief measures have been put in place, but the situation on the ground seems much different. As Professor Isaacs mentioned, hunger has increased, unemployment has increased. So I think it's going to be quite some time until we recover from this pandemic. And that's what we'll dig deeper into as we continue with this discussion. But it's not just local interventions that have affected our economy. And when I mention local interventions, I mean the interventions which have been in place to combat the coronavirus, such as the lockdown. So we live in this global community where something that happens even in Europe, for example, is able to have sort of an effect on stuff that happens here in South Africa. And speaking of Europe, in fact, there is an outbreak of a second wave of the coronavirus in Europe, in certain parts of that continent at least. And economists are warning that there will be a negative impact, particularly in the domestic tourism and exports sector, if hard lockdowns are reimposed in Europe. Could you perhaps enlighten us further on what this chain of effects actually means for us locally, Mr. Mkabela?
Thanks very much, and viewers. Like what is interesting is if I shape well, it's the global risk report has indicated that environmental aspects are the top 5 leading risk of the world in terms of the global risk report for 2020. And when you look at COVID-19, in the normality, it was not something that was predicted, or it was not as well estimated in that like report, and it happened. So you are having a lot of environmental like impacts, of which when you look at the continuity of them while we are dealing with COVID-19, part of the things we have focused much at people or saving people, but you'll find that like other environmental like impacts as well, or climate change related and environmental impacts are affecting agriculture. They are affecting they will affect manufacturing in the future and other related things. So the primary industry will be affected. From there, then you will look at other like elements where in South Africa, tourism, all over the world and in South Africa, tourism went down with more than 60 to 70%. And that gives you an understanding as well that there is a problem with, with the system of managing, people not to lose people, while like we need to save like the economy. So the complexity that we are facing 2020 is different with the complexities that like we have been probably normally attending to, but it will expect all the sectors to be having an understanding or like diagnose deeper on what solutions will be relevant to solve these like challenges, because we are expected to have environmental challenges for the decade or for the decade and more. So in that regard, if it's something that has to impact on people, then lockdown will happen, tourism will be affected. But we mustn't forget that agriculture is something that is supposed to make the global economy to recover. And if part of the climate change elements are not attended to, and they affect the sector that we need to use for the global economy to recover, it will be impactful more than what is happening now, because the challenge now, it is, I would probably say, we could manage with what we have, but if it goes to agriculture, then the situation will be out of hand.
Yes, most definitely. It is going to be interesting to see how we respond to this particular crisis that we find ourselves in, because of course we are in uncharted territories at the moment. Mr. Captain Bogan, you
Yes.
are working in the journalism field. I'm sure you are quite aware of what's been happening in, especially in the economic sector, because you've been covering these stories for years now. So we do know that the South African economy has been in serious trouble for quite some time now, even before the coronavirus reached our shores. So just how far back has the pandemic pushed the progress of pre-COVID efforts to grow the economy?
Well, I looked at the GDP figures the other day, and I think it takes us back to the level we were 6 years ago. That's in 2014. Bear in mind, we haven't had much growth since then, and we're with I think between a 8 and 10% decline in contraction in our economy this year. We'll be back to the 2014 level. Clearly, it'll hit different sectors in different ways, with tourism being very hard hit, restaurants, entertainment, and I think we'll have to wait for some time, really, to see the full effects and the employment effects. Bear in mind that we have very little real economic data to work on at this stage. The Bureau of Economic Research in Stellenbosch said this week that there was a comeback in quarter three. Retail sales are better. Quarter two, second quarter was a complete write-off, really. But there has been a bit of a rebound in quarter three. And as we go into October, if we don't have another lockdown, we'll come back a bit. But bear in mind, this country was in an economic crisis before the lockdown, and it's in an economic crisis, and it will be in an economic crisis after the lockdown. In terms of policy, we're really waiting for the economic recovery plan that will emerge from NEDLAC and the presidency at some stage. And we're also waiting for the October medium-term budget policy statement. And there we have the tiff between the technocrats, the Treasury officials, and Tito Mboweni, Finance Minister, and Department of Public Enterprises over the SAA bailout and continued bailout of state enterprises, which they're against, and the public sector wage issue. And unless those are resolved, I think we can't come out of this crisis with none of these big policy issues resolved and expect good growth. That our debt burden is mounting, and unless those issues are resolved and fully resolved, I think that we're in for a very, very hard time.
Yeah, interestingly, you mentioned that that quarter two was basically a write-off because, of course, the country was under tight lockdown. But then you mentioned that there was a rebound in quarter three, and it should improve in quarter four should there be no hard lockdown in quarter four. And that's, of course, something we are hoping does not happen. But I sense some optimism on your side, Mr. Katzenellenbogen.
No, I think I'm not optimistic that the big policy issues will be resolved and lead our way to improved growth. There's just no sign that the politics are right for that to happen. I don't think the president is prepared to make the big sorts of decisions that can lay the groundwork for economic growth, and those include privatization or liquidation of the state enterprises, so we don't have to continually bail them out and that bailing out state enterprises is not growth enhancing. We've got to resolve the deficit, and without that, we're going to be paying more and more interest. And without a far leaner and meaner state, we are not going to be able to grow. The state is a net detractor from economic growth. This has been shown for many years, and that is the case in South Africa. And unless this is resolved, this is a problem. And to resolve unemployment, they have to negotiate with the unions on changing the Labor Relations Act and bringing in legislation to allow for a minimum wage at the level of the Extended Public Works Program, which is 1142. And there's no sign that that will happen. That would really get employment going. That's where real leverage would be obtained. The question is, why is the state allowed to pay that rate and the private sector is not? It's so incongruous. So I don't see those being resolved. But South Africa could be a very, very strong emerging market, attracting a lot of international attention if it gets a good growth story. And there's not much sign of that happening yet.
Yeah, it does seem as though politics and the economy might be intertwined at some point. So, Mr. Kabela, seeing that you are a political analyst as well, just your thoughts while we are on this discussion. How do you think the leadership? Are you satisfied with the leadership that has been provided at this moment from an economic perspective?
I think we are in a situation where we have a good president that is voted by the ANC, and we find that private sector trusts such a president. I think that it makes something to be better for the economy. You can have someone who can negotiate collaborations or partnerships or public-private partnerships. So I think starting there, we have a president that can be good for triple peace or public-private partnership. But below the president, like we find that in key ministries, in a ministry like public enterprises, I think these 5 years, the main thing that was supposed to be happening these 5 years, it was mainly to turn around state-owned enterprises and to be fully functional. And that is not happening. So what will probably be the biggest challenge that will make South Africa as well fail to recover is the state-owned enterprises, because there is no solid leadership that is attending in that area and making sure that those state-owned enterprises are taken into business viability, and they are operating, as a viable like systems organizations that cannot really only rely on the state bailout continuously. I think that is the problem. And while we were in COVID-19, there was no attempt. So, you need to share like your responsibilities perfectly. So you will think that like all ministers are focusing on COVID-19, of which each and every ministry must focus on their plans and their responsibilities. And that made a very huge impact from government operations point of view. So the threats that we have, one is implementation capacity. So even if we can come up with a plan, the plan will need candidates to implement it. But since energy, hello? Main contributor to the economy, or energy is the oxygen of each and every economy. If ESCOM is not working well, it will be difficult for the manufacturing sector and the mining sector to pick up, because the prices will continue to be high. And that will be like a crisis that will need to be attended to. And then the second threat that we continue to have is systematic corruption. Even in the midst, we have been struggling with corruption for the past 10 years. But in the midst of COVID-19, you still get to see corruption that is so new and so active in the economy. And like while you are having state capture, the PIC commissions that like we are like resolving on them, you find that COVID-19 requires huge investigations because about 5 billion, so 500 like billion that was there, like you couldn't get a sense of probably what is happening with those funds and why we are unable to do things with governance and accountability as a government. So those implementation capacity and corruption will be a threat even if we have a good strategies, because those strategies will need these candidates to work on them.
Yeah, I think that's just how it is. Corruption is something really serious, a serious issue in South Africa. And I think unless we don't sort that out, just as you said, any policies we try to implement might not be much quite effective enough. So I'm sure many people are now wondering how much longer will this last, this impact, how much longer will we feel the shock waves of the COVID-19 pandemic? And I'm sure at this point it might not be very certain to say what exactly when this would end. But just an idea. I'm sure you've been doing research, Professor Isaacs. Any idea when this, how long this shockwaves might last?
Thanks very much. I mean, I think it depends about what we consider the shockwaves to be. There's the immediate crisis, but the impact of that, we're looking at least 5 years, of a recovery period. This is not going to be something which we bounce back from within 6 months. So, it's very hard to estimate accurately, but I would say we're looking at anywhere between 2 and 5 years. And that's going to be impacted on by the policy choices which are made. I mean, we'll return to this later, but I would take the opposite view to the various policy prescriptions which Jonathan has mentioned. But I'm sure we'll have time to unpack those in a bit. But it's not only about how long the South African economy takes, but also our international trading partners, and the impact globally on economic output has been severe, and will continue to be so for at least the next 18 months.
Yeah, I think we should get to that discussion in a bit. But just quickly, it's now 29 minutes past 7 Central African time. Let's just take a quick ad break. And when we get back, we will, of course, dig deeper into this discussion. Of course, I want to speak about the informal sector, how this has been impacted, and much more to come. Just a lot more we need to speak. And I'm sure we might not have exactly enough time to put in exactly what we want to discuss this evening, but we will try and we'll see where we get. And of course, don't forget your comments from the listeners. Don't forget you can send them to our WhatsApp number. The number is 0617660355. Alternatively, you can tweet and tag at Salam Media, and don't forget to use the hashtag the special focus. Those comments coming up after the ad break, but for now, please do stay tuned.
Rejuvenating media day by day. This is Salam Media.
Water is life. Donate to the Islamic Relief Water for Life campaign and give essential water aid to those in need. For just 750 Rand, you'll be able to provide life-saving access to clean and safe water. That can transform communities, prevent diseases, bring relief. Together, we can make clean water a reality. Give water, give life. Donate to Islamic Relief. www.islamic-relief.org.za.
Dad, well, I've been chatting with an investment broker today, and
Broker? Did the broker tell you that our economy is a mess? There's bushfires in Australia, America wanted World War III, and now the coronavirus is traveling around the world.
well, I also thought about purchasing some crypto.
Crypto? What's that, like another pyramid scheme? I don't trust what I can't see.
There's an apartment in Belito.
So all your family will be asking to stay there for free. And what if the government takes it away, eh?
Dad, I don't think it works like that.
I'll tell you what works. Gold. At your age, I invested in gold coins and it paid for your university fees and your wedding. No contracts, no agreements. Your investment is in your hands and you own it. With a 70% growth in only 5 years. Do you still doubt gold investment? Contact RJ Coin today. 031 202 4701 or visit them at 151 Stephen Lamini Road in Musgrave, Durban. Randery Jewelers Gold Coin Exchange. Your passport to gold investment.
It's a new beginning. It's a new era. Salam Media, humanitarian journalism.
And welcome back. You are tuned into Salam Media. This is the special focus with myself, Zahid Jadwat. We are together, of course, right up until 8 p.m. Central African time. We are discussing the economic impact of COVID-19. This, of course, as many businesses open to a new normal, and those, of course, which have managed to survive through the lockdown and the numerous restrictions which have been in place. Of course, many businesses not surviving the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are speaking to a number of experts in this field. Remember that you can participate in this conversation. You can send us a WhatsApp text message on the number 061 766 0355. You can also tweet and tag at Salam Media, or you can leave a comment below on our Facebook and YouTube live streams. So literally anything on your mind, even just a thumbs up to let us know that you are tuned in, and hopefully you are enjoying the show. So let me just recap, let me reintroduce our guests. Firstly, we have Professor Gilad Isaacs, who is the co-founder of the Institute for Economic Justice, and he's also a lecturer in economics at the School of Economic and Finance at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. We also have Mr. Jonathan Katzenellenbogen, who is a weekly finance columnist at the Daily Friend, and he's also the former economics editor at Business Day. We also have Mr. Nzabe Derek-Shongwane, SME growth consultant at the Institute of Business Advisors Southern Africa, and Mr. Mialani Mkabela, who is an economist and director at Answisa Transaction Advisory. So just continuing with this discussion which we were having before the ad break, we were speaking about how long the shockwaves might last, and Professor Isaacs saying it could be 3 to 5 years, maybe even more, and of course, many countries in Europe, a few of them actually are experiencing a second wave, and there is a likelihood of renewed lockdowns in those countries. So, Mr. Katzenellenbogen, just your thoughts on how this might impact us here in South Africa. Do you think a second lockdown is likely? A second wave, should a second wave occur? Mr. Katzenellenbogen, if you could just please unmute your mic.
My apologies. Here I am. Well,
no problem. Okay.
Spain has gone into a second lockdown. Israel, I think, has gone into a second lockdown, and there are a number of other countries that have gone into second lockdowns. But and the UK might soon go into a second lockdown. But I don't think there's the public attitude. I think public rather, for a second lockdown anywhere in the world. They've been through one at enormous cost to their economies. Individuals and families have been through considerable hardship on this. The most vulnerable have been hit very hard. And I just don't think that there was the sort of appetite for lockdowns that we had initially. And we're not sure, really, whether they in fact saved that many lives. We've still got to run the numbers on this. And so I think governments might find themselves deeply unpopular if we do go into a second lockdown. And who knows how long it's going to last. And lockdowns are going to be necessary until we have a vaccine. Now, there are 300 vaccines, development efforts on vaccines. And who knows when these will come to fruition and approval and indeed distribution. Now, it was June, Bill Gates said, oh, it's going to take about 18 months. One of the most advanced efforts has been set back. So I don't really know when we're going to come out of this. And if Europe goes into a second wave lockdowns, our tourism sector is going to be hit really hard, particularly coming up for the summer when most of the European tourists who we rely upon visit the country. And so it's all very uncertain. And I think businesses must feel this in their planning. And I'm sure that governments all around the world must be really pondering and worrying about having to take some very difficult decisions about whether their lockdowns should be extended or not. But I think at some stage they're going to say, wear masks, avoid large crowds, and the aged and the vulnerable and those with comorbidities stay home and out of the way. And people don't have to go to office workers need not go to work if they don't want to. So you continue on that basis, but you can't lock down an economies for any longer. I think we're bearing too high a price for that. Thank you.
Really be much too catastrophic for the economy, of course, locally, not a very good picture as it is. And so I think the best way forward is just to wait for the vaccine to come to be developed. And of course, that will take much time. If you've just tuned in, we are discussing the economic impact of COVID-19. And of course, this discussion going on right up until 8 p.m. this evening, Central African time. Mr. Shlungwane, there's an interesting question here, which I would like to ask you about the informal sector. So the informal sector is often considered a shock absorber for the formal economy. As we already know, the informal economy is quite large in South Africa. So do you think it has worked effectively as a shock absorber during the pandemic? Mr. Shlungwane? Okay, we are having some trouble connecting with Mr. Shlungwane, but let's just see if this question, if I could send it over to you, Mr. Mkabela. How do you think the informal economy has worked effectively as a shock absorber during the pandemic?
I think the economy from the informal sector point of view, it totally, probably you might as well think, it didn't do as one could expect, because the situation was not allowing it to as well operate. So during lockdown, it was difficult for small businesses to operate. It was difficult for whether it will be hawkers around, or informal traders to be selling in different areas. So when you look at that, you find that the situation of the virus was not as well allowing such to happen. So a lot of informal traders had to be, on a situation where they closed their businesses and they were not operating for much of the time, and you wouldn't have expected them to boost the economy in whatever way. They are in need even now more than even SMMEs, because some of the SMMEs, you'll find that they were having a good bank account, and some of the big businesses had credit facilities. But when you look at informal businesses, you find that there is a dynamic foundation of poverty as well in the foundation of it, of which that needs a lot of assistance, probably from government point of view. And our informal sector in South Africa is still not really getting that assistance from whether it's municipalities or from government at large, even though these informal traders are helping so much in society, taking their kids to, to basic and higher education. But you really don't get to see the leadership of the country since South African democracy started, to be assisting informal traders in the level where they really require assistance, because there are no loans for for them, and then you find that mainly they are unbanked, not really like your small business. So their situation gets to be very worse. So you need to work on a strategy of transitioning informal traders to formal business. And that is an opportunity that was missed around 2005 and 2006, because municipalities discussed that during those times. And when I remember well, that was not activated, because you really need to, work out, the boom of the informal economy, and transition it and connect it directly to the grid, and have ways, put legislation so that they can be easily accessing loans from banks and other things. And they get a clear support, whether it will be small business development and other developmental support and mentoring.
Yeah, so the question now is, who exactly has been most affected by the impact of COVID-19? Of course, we do know that everyone has been impacted, but there is no doubt that many people have been worse hit, some businesses not having even made it through. And that leads us to the question as well of whether or not there is enough support for these people who are worst affected. Professor Isaacs?
Thanks very much. The short answer is absolutely not. And we see this in the rescue package, which was announced. This package had the sort of three main elements which we've seen internationally, which is income support. So it is increased social grants to alleviate hunger. There is wage support, so to the transfers in order to ensure businesses don't fire workers and are able to pay them, and business rescue, either through in loans, in bailouts, in tax deferrals, and so on. So these three elements were the three elements which we've seen internationally. Unfortunately, all three have been insufficient or inadequately implemented in South Africa. So in social grants, for instance, we've seen the last announced figures were that about 4.4 million people have received the special COVID grant. That's about half of those that have applied, and it's half or less than those that are eligible. In wage support, which was offered through the UIF TERS scheme, it was inadequately funded. It was extremely difficult to access, and that the majority of applicants report not having received that. And then what we've already heard in business rescue, we've seen about a tenth of the loan guarantee scheme being offered. We have seen only 6 billion of the 100 billion rand allocation in a job creation fund allocated this year. In fact, of the alleged 500 billion rand rescue package, what we actually saw in June's supplementary budget was a net increase in 36 billion rand only. So the rescue measures have really failed in all three elements.
So much for that, Professor Isaac. Let's just try and see if we have Mr. Nzavi once again on the line, if he can hear us clearly. Mr. Nzavi, Derek Shangwani. Mr. Shangwani, can you hear us?
Yes, sir, I can hear you. I can hear you very clear.
Okay, that line is much better. So we were speaking about the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. And of course, when trying to achieve recovery goals, we must understand that the country faces constantly rising public debt, minimal GDP growth, inefficient state-owned enterprises, and the devastating effect of state capture, corruption, and mismanagement of public funds. So what exactly do you think it would take to get the economy back on track?
I think from looking at the whole thing and say how do we deal with it, I would say that the commitment should come from the big brothers to rescue the little brothers. By big brothers, I'm referring to the big corporates, where they must make a concerted effort to either finance or sponsor or create some kind of enterprise development fund that would be channeled towards, in particular, assisting the small businesses to pick up. Because if you look at the other economies that we're talking about, internationally or wherever, you'll find that I'll give an example. I think at some point in Sweden, where you'd find that the big corporate could allow the small companies to use their plants to do manufacturing and all that, so that they can be able to go back to their feet. So this is the system that in South Africa, the corporate should wake up and say, are we going to wait for government to finance? Because you cannot expect somebody who is given a handout to also extend that handout to the third or to another person. It doesn't work that way. So already the economy of South Africa, we were in debt, we were owing. So whatever that comes in as much as there is mismanagement, but over and above that, there is still an element of, there are a lot of things like now, if you listen to the government language now, it's talk about infrastructure spending. Why infrastructure spending? Because we will create jobs and we do that. But if you measure that against the US economy, you'll find that if you were to compare the grants that was given even to small business or even to individuals, in South Africa, part of that money would amount to a salary of a person. And these are the realities. To say, how do we now deal with that? To say, are we looking at it from that perspective to say, how far can this, is this going to assist us? In the economy where we are not productive enough and we are not active enough, it would be very important to focus on small business and see how do we capacitate them, such that not necessarily in a form of handouts and all that. No, how do we make sure that they are capacitated when it comes to manufacturing, capacitated when it comes to distribution, all these things, so that by the time they create these jobs, they are not struggling themselves. They'll be able to pay out the salaries. Instead of waiting for the third tier of the tier of the payment of UIF and all that, the jobs can be created only if we can make that investment into the small business. But unfortunately, we are sitting with a referee and a player here, where the government has to rescue the SAA or any other parastatal. If you look at PRASA itself will need a huge investment to come back to operation fully. Now you ask yourself, if we are still faced with these giant kind of needs, how will small businesses get assisted? Corporate South Africa can step in and say, how do we help our little brothers? Because if corporate South Africa can step in, instead of giving money to NGOs and all that, they can empower small business that can assist in giving to NGOs also, but on the money that is able to generate revenues and generate income, and then the money that can go and be spent We can feed the poor, we can feed the hungry, but if we don't create opportunities, we'll keep on feeding until the very same small business owners get in the line of being fed also, because they don't have resources to be able to resuscitate their business.
And I think that's a really interesting way to put it in the analogy of a bigger brother helping the smaller brother. Mr. Katzenellenbogen, just your thoughts on that which Mr. Nzave has had to say regarding how we can get the economy back on track. Mr. Katzenellenbogen. Mr. Katzenellenbogen, may I just remind you to unmute your mic once again?
My apologies. The schemes set up by the Ruperts and the Oppenheimers worked well. They dispersed these loans to small businesses very rapidly. Each family gave made available $1 billion, and what they did quite intelligently is got the banks, Standard Bank, Nedbank, and I think the other banks, to actually disperse those loans. So, these banks know their clients, and they were able to do so fairly rapidly. But having said that, on small businesses, the problem is that many small businesses do not want to take on additional debt, and therefore would not go for these type of loans, which allow them to retain labor. They don't know if they're going to be around, and debt is a burden, and they just didn't want that type of money. And I think that on additional help, I think that greater government should have used the private charities, of which there are many in South Africa. Some of which we've heard of, Gift of the Givers and the Salvation Army, Johannesburg Child Feeding, and others. But there are many others throughout the country. And what's interesting is that the government really didn't want to use those. They wanted to distribute food themselves to gain political credit. And had these organizations been fully used, I think a far better job would have been done, because they're exceptional. This is what they do day in and day out, is they feed people, and they know how to do it very well. The government does aid them, but it's a limited amount. But they could have gained far greater leverage doing it through these very effective private charities that we have in South Africa.
Yeah, and with just about 7 minutes remaining until 8 p.m. Central African time, I think it's about time that we begin wrapping up, although we have much more to discuss, because this discussion really could go on for much longer. But just speaking about the role that government has to play in reviving our economy, and likewise the role that the private sector has to play in this major effort. Of course, I think most of us, all of us would this has to be a collective effort if we want to restore our economy. So what roles does government and the private sector have in reviving the economy? Professor Isaacs?
Thanks. I mean, I think it's important for us to recognize that there is one biggest brother, and that's government. And government has the central role to play here. If a private charities might reach a fair amount of people, there is 17 million grant recipients in South Africa. If you want to transfer funds, it's through that mechanism. Government's budget is 1.5 trillion rand. If it needs extra resources, then the wealth of the Ruperts and others should be taxed, and us not rely on a largesse. But I think we've got to see this in two ways. The first is that an economy and businesses are harder to restart than they are to keep alive. right? And we have to keep alive the existing economy, and we're failing at that. If the economy shrinks, you see a downward spiral of reduced revenue and increased debt. So what we want to do is that there has to be a significant short-term injection of funds by government into the economy, including, as Jonathan rightly notes, that there is businesses who are not interested in extra loans and who really need bailouts. And we failed at this first stage of a rescue, of a recovery plan, a smaller state, a slashing in a public sector wage bill, a reduction in minimum wages. All of those would undermine an economic recovery. All of those would mean less spending in the economy, and all of those would mean a state less able to provide the sorts of social services, health, education, and the economic infrastructure, roads, rails, ports, and so on, which are essential for economic recovery. Similarly, we need state-owned enterprises which are effective, which aren't corrupt, but which can serve a developmental purpose. There is no other entity which can deliver the type of energy transition towards renewable energies which we need, besides ESCOM, which has been at the heart of the economy for 100 years. And so what we do absolutely need to see an improvement in the capacity, in the implementation, in governance of these entities. But it's these entities which can create the economic environment and provide the economic infrastructure through which we can see both private sector investment and the sustaining of livelihoods of ordinary South Africans.
Yeah, I've just got 2 minutes remaining of the show, so I think it's about time we start wrapping up. So just your final thoughts on the economic impact of COVID-19 and the way forward, Mr. Shlongwane?
I wanted to make the final thought is that the government, the civil servants should be civil servants, not civil servants and entrepreneurs at the same time, because that's where we have conflict.
Yeah.
Because even if you look at the kind of relief now that we need to look at, the problem sits with, we have civil servants who are also entrepreneurs who have interest in what they should not be focusing on, and now the real entrepreneurs are struggling. And if that can be, the line can be drawn, the focus could be paid into helping entrepreneurs to be able to get back into their feet.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Zahid Jadwat. Your final thoughts, Mr. Jonathan Katzenellenbogen?
There's a lot that has been said this evening, and I think it's been a very useful conversation. Gillard made a number of points, but if state-owned enterprises were run independently of government, i.e., the management was completely independent, they'd have a chance. But that isn't the case, and that's a deep problem. The grant system is an enormous poverty alleviator and provides that social net. But it's not proved to be very efficient in the distribution of grants in this crisis, when one has needed it to perform emergency sorts of things. And I think that there's a far greater role that the private sector could play. But I think, this crisis is going to be with us for a lot. In conclusion, this crisis is going to be with us for a very, very long time, as well as the consequences. We just don't know when this vaccine is going to become available. And we can't really wait for the vaccine to become available to get going with our normal lives and economic activity. It's just impossible. We've done governments have done early stage lockdowns, but we can't go into a second stage lockdown. The price is just too high. And let's just protect those who are most vulnerable. That's what I would like to conclude with. Thank you very much. It's been a good conversation.
Thank you so much. Professor Isaac, your final thoughts?
I think I've laid out some of what I think in recovery. The last thing I would just say is I think it's important that we elevate a wide range of voices in our society. This has been an excellent conversation. It is unfortunate that it is 5 men engaged here. And I think that moving forward, we need to create lots of environments where we make sure that we're hearing from and engaging with the widest range of South Africans in planning and understanding what sort of a future we are aiming for.
Indeed, definitely. We will look into that in future discussions. In fact, we had sent out invitations to a few female economic analysts, but I think due to time restraints and stuff, it was just a bit impossible for them to get back to us in time for the discussion. But anyway, thank you so much for such a fascinating discussion this evening. Professor Gilad Isaacs, co-director of the Institute for Economic Justice and lecturer in economics at the School of Economic and Finance at the University of Witwatersrand, Mr. Jonathan Katzenellenbogen, finance columnist at the Daily Friend and former economics editor at Business Day, Mr. Nzavi Derek Shlungwane, SME growth consultant at the Institute of Business Advisors Southern Africa, and last but not least, Mr. Mialanim Kabela, who is an economist and director at Answisa Transaction and Advisory. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how we get our economy back on track, and I think it's going to take a collective effort to improve the situation. It won't happen overnight from what I see. I think it's going to take some time, but I think patience is what we really need, and of course the spirit of Ubuntu to get us through this difficult time. But from myself, Zahid Jadwat, and the technical team at Salami, Mr. Sadiq Joseph, thank you so much for tuning in this evening, and thank you to the guests for your contribution. A happy Heritage Day in advance to you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.